Pregnant millionaire pretends to be asleep to test a poor single-dad janitor. What he did left her in tears. Before we begin, if this story moves you, drop a in the comments and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. It means the world. The elevator doors opened at 11:47 p.m., and Eleanor Hartwell stepped onto the 32nd floor of Hartwell Tower with the careful, deliberate pace of a woman who had learned, the hard way, never to rush. One hand rested on the curve of her belly, 6 months full and unmistakably round beneath the fitted black skirt that still, somehow managed to look like it had been tailored for exactly this version of her body. The other hand gripped a manila folder thick enough to double as a weapon. The floor was dark except for her office at the far end of the hall, where a single desk lamp burned amber against the glass. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. Her assistant, her legal team, her VP of operations, all of them tucked into their apartments somewhere across Manhattan, dreaming of weekends and approval ratings. Eleanor had sent them home herself. She always did. She was 31 years old, the founder and CEO of Hartwell Capital, and she was, by every measurable standard, untouchable. Her photograph had appeared on the cover of Fortune twice. She had been called ruthless, visionary, and, her personal favorite, the woman who doesn't need anyone. She wore that last one like a badge of honor, even on the nights when it felt more like a wound. Tonight was one of those nights. She set the folder on her desk and lowered herself slowly into the chair. A motion that required more negotiation with her own body than she would ever admit out loud. The baby shifted, a rolling press against her ribs, and Eleanor placed her palm flat against the side of her stomach and held it there for a moment. Just a moment. "Not yet," she whispered. "Mama's got work to do." She opened the folder. Inside were the financial projections for the Meridian acquisition, a deal that had been circling her desk for 6 weeks like a slow-moving storm. If it closed, Hartwell Capital would expand into 3 new markets and double its portfolio value before her maternity leave even began. If it didn't close, she'd spend the next 4 months fielding questions from her board about whether the pregnancy had affected her judgment. It hadn't. Nothing affected her judgment. That was the problem, some people said. Eleanor thought those people were simply not paying attention. She worked for 40 minutes without looking up. The numbers aligned themselves in her mind the way they always did. Clean, logical, reassuring in their predictability. Unlike people. People were never clean. People always wanted something, and the longer Eleanor had been wealthy, the longer that list of wants had grown. Money, connections, influence, access, affection offered strategically, like currency. She had stopped trusting people sometime around her 26th year, when her business partner of 3 years, a man she had considered her closest friend, had quietly been selling her client data to a competitor for 18 months. She had discovered it by accident, a single misplaced email, and the legal fallout had taken 2 years to resolve. The emotional fallout had never fully resolved at all. Since then, she tested people, not overtly, not with polygraphs or formal screenings, though her HR department did run thorough background checks on everyone who worked above the 14th floor. She tested them the old-fashioned way. She watched. She created situations. She waited to see what people did when they thought no one was looking. It was, she had decided, the only reliable method. At 12:34 a.m., she heard the service elevator at the end of the hall release a soft mechanical exhale. And then the familiar rumble of a cleaning cart being wheeled across the marble floor. Eleanor glanced up through the glass wall of her office. A man in a gray uniform appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had memorized every inch of this floor. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of posture that suggested he'd been built for harder work than this, but had made peace with where he'd landed. Yellow rubber gloves on both hands, heavy boots that should have made noise but somehow didn't. William Caldwell. She knew his name from the building's staff roster, which she had reviewed personally when she'd first leased the tower 3 years ago. 36 years old, single father, no criminal record. References from 2 previous janitorial positions, both glowing in that particular way that made HR assume he was either genuinely exceptional or had simply never been caught doing anything wrong. Eleanor had decided 3 weeks ago that she wanted to find out which one it was. She had arranged it carefully. She'd told her head of security, Robert, to pull the overnight camera feeds for this floor offline for maintenance, a routine procedure that wouldn't raise questions. She'd asked her assistant to make sure it was known among the cleaning staff that the 32nd floor would be unwatched tonight. Not announced directly, just mentioned casually in the break room. The way things always traveled in a building like this. Whispered along the edges of the workday like smoke finding its way under a door. She wanted to see what William Caldwell did when he believed no one was watching. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, set her reading glasses on the desk, and closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Eleanor Hartwell had not fully slept since she was 23 years old and running her first fund out of a studio apartment in Brooklyn. But she could be still. She could quiet her breathing and soften the lines of her face and make herself look. From a distance, like a woman who had finally surrendered to exhaustion. She was very good at this. She had practiced. The cart grew louder as William moved down the hallway, then quieter as he passed the glass conference rooms. Eleanor kept her eyes closed, kept her breathing slow. Her right hand remained curved over her belly. She hadn't planned that detail, but it felt right, natural. She was a pregnant woman who had fallen asleep at her desk. There was nothing suspicious about that. There was nothing she could do to protect herself. She was, by every visible sign, completely vulnerable. She heard him stop outside her office door. The pause lasted 3 full seconds. She counted them. Then she heard the soft sound of the door being pushed open. Careful, measured, the kind of gentleness that people only used when they were trying not to disturb someone. The cart stayed in the hallway. He'd left it outside. William Caldwell stepped into Eleanor Hartwell's office alone. And Eleanor kept her eyes closed and waited to find out exactly who he was. The room was quiet enough that she could hear his breathing, steady, unhurried. She heard him set something down softly on the small table near the door. His supplies, she assumed, a bottle of cleaner, a cloth. She heard him move to the far side of the room, away from her desk, away from her. He began to clean, not her desk, not the area around her. He moved to the bookshelves along the far wall, wiping them down with a careful, methodical rhythm. She heard the soft drag of cloth against wood, the faint squeak of glass being polished. He was cleaning the parts of the office that were farthest from her, working his way around the perimeter, giving her the widest possible berth. Eleanor felt something strange move through her chest. She kept her face still. Several minutes passed. She heard him crouch down near the far corner, the built-in cabinet where she kept old client files, and clean along the base of it. She heard him straighten. Move to the window. Wipe it down with the particular care of someone who took pride in a job that most people didn't bother to notice. And then she heard him stop. A long pause. Longer than the others. She heard him exhale. Not dramatically, not in frustration. Just a quiet breath. The kind that escapes when a person is thinking. Then she heard the soft crinkle of something being unfolded. A jacket, maybe. No, something lighter. A spare cloth from his cart, she thought at first, but the sound was wrong. Too soft. Too deliberate. She heard him approach her desk. Her pulse rose. She kept her breathing even. He stopped 2 feet away from her. She could feel his presence, the warmth of another person in proximity, the small displacement of air. She was aware of every muscle in her body and the effort it took to keep them all still. And then she felt it, the softest, most careful weight settling across her shoulders. She almost opened her eyes. She almost broke it. He had draped something over her. A jacket, his own, she realized, the grey uniform jacket he'd taken off without her hearing it. He'd folded it gently across her shoulders, covering her arms, pulling the collar up just slightly around her neck. She felt him make a minute adjustment, barely a touch, more like a breath. to make sure it wouldn't slip. Then he stepped back. She heard him pick up his supplies from the table by the door. She heard him step out of the office and ease the door closed behind him. Slowly, so the latch wouldn't click. She heard the cart begin moving again down the hallway. His footsteps resuming their quiet rhythm, growing fainter, until the service elevator swallowed the sound entirely. And Eleanor Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Capital, 31 years old, 6 months pregnant, and absolutely alone on the 32nd floor of her own building, opened her eyes. The jacket was warm. It smelled like clean laundry and something faintly cedar-like, and it was lying across her shoulders with the care of something placed there by a person who had wanted nothing in return. She looked at the window he had cleaned. The glass was spotless, and through it, Manhattan burned with 10,000 lights. Indifferent and blazing, the same city it had always been. Eleanor pressed her lips together. She felt the baby move again, a slow, rolling shift, like a question being asked from the inside. Her eyes filled with tears, and she did not understand why, and she did not try to stop them. William Caldwell had learned to be invisible a long time ago. Not in the way that broken people became invisible, not from shame, not from defeat. He had learned it the way a craftsman learns a technique, deliberately because it was useful, because the world ran more smoothly when certain people moved through it without drawing attention to themselves. He had learned it. Specifically in the years after his wife left, when he had become the only adult in his daughter's life, and had understood, with the absolute clarity that fatherhood has a way of delivering, that his feelings about that fact were entirely beside the point. Maya needed him present, so he was present, everything else was noise. He thought about her now as he guided his cart to the service elevator and pressed the button for the 28th floor. It was nearly 1 a.m. She was at Mrs. Petrakis's apartment 2 blocks from their building. His neighbor, a 70-year-old Greek woman who had declared herself Maya's honorary grandmother on approximately their 3rd day in the building and had been making good on that title ever since. Mrs. Petrakis kept odd hours herself and had told William, more than once, that she preferred having a child in the apartment to watching television. William had stopped arguing about it 6 months ago. Maya would be asleep by now. She always fell asleep by 8:30, her small body curled around the stuffed rabbit she'd named Gerald, a name she had arrived at independently and defended fiercely when her preschool teacher had suggested it was unusual for a rabbit. She was 6 years old and had opinions like an attorney. William had no idea where she'd gotten that from. He suspected it might be genetic. The elevator opened, and he pushed the cart out onto 28, the floor that housed the company's mid-level administrative offices. He started with the conference room, always the conference room first, because it was the largest and the one most likely to have been destroyed by the end of the workday. Tonight, it was moderately catastrophic. 3 coffee cups left on the table, a dry erase board covered in diagrams that someone had drawn with a red marker directly onto the whiteboard surface instead of the paper roll attached beside it, and a paper plate with what appeared to be the remnants of a birthday cake sitting in the center of the table like a small, sugary crime scene. William cleaned it without complaint. He was good at cleaning things without complaint. It was, he had come to believe, an undervalued skill. He had taken this job 14 months ago, after the logistics company where he'd worked as a regional coordinator had downsized its entire middle management tier in a single Friday afternoon meeting. 42 people. Gone. William had been one of them. He'd had 2 weeks of severance, a 6-year-old daughter, and a rent check due in 11 days. He'd walked out of that meeting room and driven directly to a staffing agency and filled out an application for anything that was available immediately and paid a living wage. Hartwell Building Services had called him back within 24 hours. He had never intended it to be permanent. He still didn't. Exactly. Though the meaning of permanent had gotten more complicated as the months passed, and the job turned out to have benefits that his previous position hadn't, and a stability of schedule that let him be at school pickup every day at 3:15 without negotiating it with anyone. There was something to be said for that. He was still deciding how much. He finished the conference room and moved to the row of individual offices along the east wall. He had a system, Always the same order, always the same method, and he moved through it efficiently, the way he moved through most things in his life. There was comfort in routine. Maya understood that better than most adults did. She had her own routines. Breakfast first, then teeth, then shoes. Always shoes last, because shoes were, in her words, the final boss. And she protected them with a seriousness that William found both funny and quietly moving. She was like him in that way, anchored by the small ceremonies of ordinary life. He was somewhere in the middle of the third office when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting Mrs. Petrakis. She sometimes sent him updates if Maya woke up. But the name on the screen was his brother, Daniel. William stared at it for a moment. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and kept working. Daniel called again 20 minutes later. Then a third time at 1:47 a.m. William let all three go to voicemail. Daniel only called late at night when he wanted money, and William didn't have money to give, and that conversation, like all conversations with Daniel, would take more emotional energy than William currently had available. He would listen to the voicemails tomorrow, on his lunch break, when he was sitting outside on the loading dock with his thermos of coffee and 24 minutes of uninterrupted quiet. That was the plan. He finished 28 and took the elevator back up to 32 to retrieve his supply bag from outside the CEO's office. He'd left it in the hall when he went in to clean around her. He'd also left his jacket. He didn't think about that until he was already on the elevator, and when he did, he felt a quick flush of something. Not embarrassment, exactly. More like the feeling of having done something impulsive that he couldn't take back and wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. She'd looked cold. That was all. She was pregnant and asleep in a desk chair, and the office was air-conditioned to what felt like 58 degrees, and his jacket had been right there on the cot, and it had seemed like the only reasonable response to the situation, like what any person would do. He collected his bag from the hallway. The office light was still on inside. Through the glass he could see her at the desk, the jacket still across her shoulders, her head still resting on her folded arms. He stood there for exactly 2 seconds longer than he should have. Then he went to the elevator and went home. He got back to his building at 2:53 a.m. and let himself into Mrs. Petrakis' apartment with the spare key she'd given him. Maya was exactly where he'd expected, on the pull-out sofa in the living room, buried under 3 blankets despite the warmth of the apartment, Gerald the rabbit tucked under her chin. Her blonde hair had spread across the pillow in all directions, the way it always did when she slept, and her mouth was open just slightly, and she looked so entirely peaceful that William stood in the doorway for a long moment without moving. He thought about the woman upstairs. He thought about the curve of her hand resting on her stomach. The way it had looked, protective and reflexive, the gesture of a body guarding something it had already decided to love. He thought that the world was full of people doing their best in circumstances that hadn't asked their permission, and that this was, in the end, the most human thing there was. He got Maya's shoes from by the door, little white shoes with a bow on each one, tucked them under his arm, scooped her up with the practice of a man who had done this 10,000 times, and carried her the 2 blocks home through the quiet Manhattan night. She didn't wake up. She never did. She trusted. In her sleep, completely. He put her to bed. He set Gerald on the pillow beside her. He turned off the light and stood in the doorway of her small room and breathed. Tomorrow she had a field trip to the Natural History Museum, and she had been planning her outfit for it since Tuesday. She had decided on the pink dress, the bright pink one that she called the important dress, reserved for occasions she considered significant. The museum, in Maya's estimation, was definitely significant. She had informed William of this at breakfast, at dinner, and at bath time, in case he had forgotten. He hadn't forgotten. He set his alarm for 6:15, took a shower, and lay down on top of his bed without bothering to pull the covers back. He was asleep within 4 minutes. He did not dream about Eleanor Hartwell. He did not dream about the way her shoulders had looked in the amber light, or the way the jacket had settled across them like something fragile and necessary. He did not think, consciously, about any of it. But at 3:22 a.m., In the deep still of a night that asked nothing of him, William Caldwell smiled in his sleep. And if Maya had been awake to see it, she would have said with the authority of a 6-year-old who knew her father's face better than she knew her own, "Daddy looks like he found something good." Eleanor did not mention the jacket. She arrived at the office at 7:15 the next morning, later than usual, because she had actually slept, deeply and without the fragmented, guilty quality that her sleep had taken on over the past several months. She had woken in the chair at 3:40 a.m. with the grey jacket still across her shoulders. And she had sat there for a long time without moving, listening to the building settle around her, before she'd finally taken a car home to her apartment on the Upper East Side. She had slept again there, in her actual bed, for almost 4 hours. It was the most consecutive sleep she'd had in weeks. She had folded the jacket. She had placed it carefully on the corner of the credenza beside the door, where the cleaning staff would see it when they came in the morning. That was the neutral thing to do. The ordinary thing. She had not left a note. She had not indicated in any way that she was aware of what had happened. But she had stood there with the folded jacket in her hands for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the grey fabric, and she had thought, "Who is this man?" Not rhetorically, genuinely. She wanted to know. Her assistant, Priya, arrived at 7:50 with a coffee, decaf, which Eleanor had been drinking since week 14 with a resentment she kept entirely internal, and a briefing sheet for the morning's calls. Eleanor took both without looking up from the document she was reviewing. "Pull William Caldwell's full personnel file," she said. "The overnight janitor, 32nd floor." Priya paused in the act of setting down the coffee. "The maintenance staff files are handled through building services. I'd have to request them from facilities." "Then request them. Is there a specific concern I should—" "No specific concern." Eleanor finally looked up. "I'd like to review it personally, today." Priya, who had worked for Eleanor for 3 years and had learned, at some cost, exactly which questions were worth asking, nodded once and left without further inquiry. The file arrived on Eleanor's desk at 10:40. She waited until her 11 o'clock call had ended and the conference room had cleared before she opened it. William James Caldwell, born October 14, 1987, age 36, current address 174, Arden Street, apartment 4C, Washington Heights. Previous employment, Hartwell Building Services, 14 months. Before that, Meridian Logistics Group, Regional Operations Coordinator, 6 years. Before that, 2 years in a smaller logistics firm in New Jersey. Education, B.S. in Business Administration, Fordham University, 2009. Eleanor stopped. She reread the line, Meridian Logistics Group. She pulled up the Meridian acquisition folder on her second screen. The deal she'd been reviewing last night, the one sitting in the manila folder that had been keeping her in the office at midnight. Meridian Logistics, the company she was in the final stages of purchasing. The company that, 18 months ago, had conducted a mass layoff of its entire middle management tier. 42 people, including, apparently, one William Caldwell, who had then walked into a staffing agency and taken the first job available and spent the last 14 months cleaning the offices of the woman who was currently in the process of acquiring the company that had let him go. Eleanor sat back in her chair. She thought about this for a long time. Then she picked up the file again and kept reading. Emergency contact. Maya Rose Caldwell, daughter, age 6. Secondary emergency contact. Carmen Petrakis, listed as family friend. No other family contacts listed. Mother of child. Diane Caldwell, listed as not in contact. Eleanor looked at the name for a moment. Not in contact. The form had a field for relationship status, and William had left it blank. She noted that. She closed the file and turned her chair to face the window. Manhattan was grey today, a low sky pressing down over the skyline with the particular quality of early November. And she could see her own reflection faintly in the glass. Blonde hair pulled back, black coat, the unmistakable shape of her pregnancy, making her silhouette something she still sometimes found surprising. as if her body had made a decision her mind hadn't quite caught up with yet. She placed her hand on her stomach. The baby was quiet this morning, resting. "Your father is not in the picture either," Eleanor said to her belly very quietly. "In case you were wondering, it wasn't a secret. The people who needed to know, knew. The father was a man she had dated for 8 months, a venture capitalist, handsome and well-connected, and ultimately revealed to be, in the way of so many well-connected, handsome men, primarily interested in what being connected to her could do for him. She had ended it cleanly at week 11, before she had told him about the pregnancy, because she had looked at him across a dinner table one night and realized with complete calm that she did not trust him. Not with the company, not with her life, not with a child. She was going to do this alone. She had made her peace with it. The question that came to her now, unexpected, a little uncomfortable, was whether alone was actually the goal, or whether it was simply the option that had always felt safest. She was still considering this when Priya knocked and opened the door. "Your 2 o'clock is in the lobby." Eleanor nodded. She closed the file, but she didn't put it away. That night, she stayed late again. Not because of the acquisition, though there was still work to be done on it. She stayed because at 11:47, exactly as it had happened the night before, the service elevator exhaled at the end of the hall, and she heard the wheels of the cart on the marble floor, and she looked up through the glass wall to see William Caldwell moving down the corridor. She had not staged anything tonight. No false sleep. No test. She was simply at her desk, working, in plain sight. He saw her. She could tell the exact moment it happened. A barely perceptible shift in his pace, a slight adjustment of his posture. Not nervousness exactly. Awareness. He continued toward her office door and knocked twice on the open frame. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. "I can come back later if you need more time." His voice was even, direct, not obsequious, not the apologetic over-softness that some of the building staff slipped into around her. Just a straightforward offer. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She thought about the jacket, folded on the credenza. She thought about Meridian Logistics. She thought about not in contact and an emergency contact who was 6 years old. "You're not interrupting," she said. "Come in." He nodded and brought the cart to the hallway side and began working on the areas away from her, as he had the night before. Eleanor turned back to her screen, but she was aware of him in the room with a specificity that surprised her, the quiet competence of his movements, the absence of any bid for her attention. After several minutes, she said without looking up, "You worked at Meridian Logistics." The sound of his cloth on the window stopped. "That's right," he said. A pause. "Is that a problem?" "No." She did look up now. He was facing her, expression unreadable but attentive. "I'm acquiring them." Something moved across his face. Quick, carefully controlled. "I heard something about that. Through the building." "What did you hear?" "That Hartwell Capital was in late-stage negotiations." He held her gaze. "I didn't know it was your company until I started here." The implication hung between them, that he had walked into this building not knowing who had leased it, and stayed anyway when he found out, and had never brought it up, and had been, as far as she could observe, entirely professional about all of it. "That must have been strange," Eleanor said. "It was a coincidence," William said. "They happen." Eleanor considered him. She thought of everything she had read in his file. She thought of the jacket, still sitting on her credenza. She thought of a 6-year-old girl in a pink dress who was someone's entire world. "You have a daughter," she said. The shift in his expression this time was different, immediate and unguarded, the way some people's faces go when they are ambushed by something they love. "Maya. She's 6. What's she like?" He looked at her with something between surprise and careful thought, as if he was deciding how much honesty the situation warranted. "She's the most interesting person I know," he said finally. And then, because he apparently couldn't help it, she named her stuffed rabbit Gerald. Eleanor blinked. And then, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she laughed. A real one, unperformed and startled out of her. and she pressed her fingers to her mouth and found that her eyes were filling again, the way they had last night, the way things apparently happened now when she was not prepared for them. William Caldwell looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not pity. It was not satisfaction. It was something quieter and more serious than either. "When are you due?" he asked. "January," she said. "The 14th. He nodded slowly, as though he was doing the calculation. "Long nights before then?" "Yes." "You shouldn't sleep in the chair." He said it matter-of-factly, without accusation. "It's not good for your back." Eleanor went very still. She looked at him. He looked back, and his expression told her everything she needed to know. He had known she was awake. Last night, in her office, in the chair, the grey jacket folded over her shoulders, he had known. He had done it anyway. The room held both of them in silence for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then William Caldwell picked up his cloth, turned back to the bookshelf, and continued working. And Eleanor Hartwell sat at her desk, with her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and neither of them said anything else for the rest of the night. But somewhere in the silence between them, something had cracked open, something that had been sealed shut for a very long time. And Eleanor could feel the cold air of it, and the strange, terrifying warmth just underneath. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know about the phone calls William had been ignoring from his brother, or what Daniel Caldwell wanted, or how far a desperate man would go when he believed the answer was no. She did not know that in 6 days, everything she thought she understood about trust, about risk, about what it meant to let someone in, was going to be tested in a way her staged midnight test had never come close to approximating. She only knew that the window was clean, and the jacket had been warm, and a man who had every reason to take advantage of her vulnerability had instead covered her shoulders and quietly closed the door. For now, that was the thing she held on to. For now, that was enough. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon, 6 days after Eleanor Hartwell had laughed in her office for the first time in longer than she could remember. William was at school pickup, standing at the edge of the sidewalk outside Myers Elementary School with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. The replacement jacket, a dark navy one he'd pulled from the back of his closet after leaving the grey one behind. When his phone rang, and the screen showed a number he didn't recognize, he almost let it go. He'd been letting a lot of things go to voicemail lately, a habit born from the 3 unanswered calls from Daniel that were still sitting there like small, unexploded objects at the bottom of his inbox. He answered it anyway. Something made him. "Is this William Caldwell?" A woman's voice. Professional, clipped. "It is." "Mr. Caldwell, my name is Sandra Okafor. I'm an attorney with Greystone Legal Partners. I'm calling on behalf of a client who has retained us in connection with Hartwell Capital's acquisition of Meridian Logistics Group." A pause. "Specifically regarding an internal audit of employee termination records from 18 months ago." William stood very still on the sidewalk. Around him, children were beginning to stream through the school's front doors, backpacks bouncing, voices layered over each other in the particular joyful chaos of 3:15 on a Thursday. He took a step sideways, away from the noise. "I'm listening," he said. "Our client has reason to believe that the mass layoff at Meridian 18 months ago was conducted in violation of Federal WARN Act regulations, which require 60 days advance notice prior to a qualifying plant closing or mass layoff. 42 employees were terminated with 2 weeks severance and no prior notification. If this is accurate, those employees may be entitled to back pay and benefits for the notification period." Another pause. "Your name is on the affected employee list, Mr. Caldwell. I'm reaching out to gauge your interest in joining a potential class action." The school doors swung open again, and Maya came through them, her blonde hair streaming behind her, her pink dress, the important dress worn today because they were getting ice cream after pickup. A Thursday tradition, bright as a signal flare against the gray November afternoon. She spotted him, and her face opened into the particular joy that 6-year-olds produce with their whole bodies, and she ran toward him with her arms already reaching. William held up one finger, 1 second, and she slowed to a walk without complaint. Which was either maturity or the ice cream negotiation. He wasn't sure which. "Who is your client?" he asked the attorney. "I'm not able to disclose that at this stage." A practiced pause. "But I can tell you that they have significant resources and are very serious about pursuing this." He thought about Meridian. He thought about that Friday afternoon meeting, the conference room, the HR representative who couldn't maintain eye contact, the 2 weeks of severance that he'd stretched across 11 days of panic before the Hartwell job had called him back. He thought about 41 other people who had walked out of that building the same way he had. Some of them older, some of them with mortgages and no savings and children in college. "Send me the information," he said. "I'll review it." He gave her his email address. He hung up. Maya arrived at his side and took his hand with the automatic confidence of a child who has never once doubted she would be received. "Who was that?" "Work stuff," he said. "How was school?" "We learned about volcanoes," she said, in the tone of someone reporting breaking news. "Did you know the lava is actually called magma until it comes out? And then it's lava. It changes its name." "I did not know that," William said, which was not entirely true. But her delight in telling him was worth more than accuracy. "I think that's like when you get a job," Maya said thoughtfully as they started walking. "You're just a person, and then you get the job, and you have a different name, like you're a janitor." "Custodian," William said. "Same thing," Maya said. "Gerald thinks so too." William looked down at his daughter, at the top of her bright blonde head, the small hand in his, the absolute certainty with which she moved through the world, and felt the familiar mix of love and something that was almost fear, the particular terror of being someone's only anchor. He thought about the attorney's call. He thought about Hartwell Capital and Eleanor and the acquisition that was almost complete. He thought about 42 people who hadn't gotten 60 days' notice. He thought about the fact that whatever he decided, the ground was about to shift. He bought Maya her ice cream. 2 scoops, strawberry and mint chip, her standing order, and sat across from her at the small table by the window of the shop and watched her eat it with the focused pleasure of someone who understood that some things deserved full attention. He thought about what the attorney had said. He thought about what he hadn't said to anyone. Not yet, because there was something else. Something the attorney didn't know, because William hadn't told anyone, because he hadn't been sure what to do with it. In his last week at Meridian, while he was cleaning out his office, a process that had taken 2 hours and required him to confront exactly how much of his life had been stored in that building, he had found, in the shared network drive that all regional coordinators accessed, a folder he hadn't created and hadn't been meant to see. It had been misfiled, wedged between 2 quarterly reports with slightly wrong naming conventions, and he had almost deleted it without opening it. He had opened it. The contents had made his blood go cold. He had not told anyone. He had copied the files to an external drive, locked the drive in the fireproof box in his closet, and spent the subsequent 14 months trying to decide what to do with information that could, depending on how it landed, either mean nothing or mean a great deal. The attorney's call had just changed the calculation. He watched Maya finish her ice cream. He watched her drag her spoon along the inside of the cup to get the last of it, her face a study in concentration. "Daddy," she said, without looking up, "are you worried about something?" He considered lying. He considered the easy reassurance that adults deployed automatically when children asked inconvenient questions. He had always tried not to do that with Maya. She was 6 years old and she noticed things. "A little bit," he said, "but it's okay. I'm figuring it out." She looked at him with eyes that were her mother's shape, but all her own in their expression, direct, patient, older than they should have been. "Okay," she said. She reached across the table and patted his hand twice, with the gravity of a much older person, and then went back to her cup. William looked at his daughter's small hand and thought about Eleanor Hartwell, 6 months pregnant and alone in her office at midnight, with no emergency contact listed anywhere that wasn't also her employee. He thought about the files in the fireproof box in his closet. He thought, somebody should know. The question was who. That evening, after Maya was asleep, he took the external drive from the box and plugged it into his laptop and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the files for the first time in months. They were worse than he remembered. Not dramatically worse. Not movie villain worse. Just the quiet, spreadsheet-level worse that was somehow more disturbing than anything theatrical. Columns of numbers that didn't align with what the company had reported publicly. Internal communications between senior executives discussing the layoffs not as a financial necessity, but as a deliberate strategy to suppress an audit that was already underway. Someone at Meridian had known the WARN Act violations were coming. Someone had calculated that paying 2 weeks of severance to 42 employees was cheaper than the alternative. And someone, buried in the email chain, had CC'd a name that made William's chest go tight when he saw it now with fresh eyes. R. Davenport, Hartwell Capital, Preliminary Acquisition Review. Hartwell Capital had been in contact with Meridian during the period of the layoffs. Whether that contact was innocent, due diligence, standard acquisition review, or something more, he couldn't tell from what he had. But the name was there. And Eleanor was the one acquiring Meridian. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about her in the office, the jacket, the laugh she hadn't been able to stop, the way she'd said January 14th like it was both a deadline and a lifeline. He thought about the fact that he genuinely did not believe she knew. He thought about the fact that he could be wrong. He closed the laptop. He sat in the dark kitchen of his small apartment and listened to the building around him. Pipes, wind, the distant sound of a television from the floor above. Maya's door was slightly open, the way she liked it, a sliver of nightlight spilling into the hall. He made a decision. He was going to tell her. Not the attorney. Not yet. Eleanor first. Because if she didn't know, she deserved to. And because if she did know, he needed to look at her face when he said it and find out. He would know. He was certain of that. He had spent 14 months watching people when they thought no one was looking. He had gotten very good at seeing what was actually there. He went to sleep. He set his alarm. He did not sleep well, but he slept. And in the morning, Maya came into his room at 6:42 wearing Gerald under one arm and announced that today was going to be a good day. And he believed her, because she had never once been wrong about that. Eleanor found out on a Monday, not from William. That was the thing she would turn over in her mind afterward, in the weeks and months when she had time to reconstruct the sequence of events and understand what had actually happened and in what order. She found out from her own legal team, before William had the chance to tell her himself. Robert Davenport, her VP of Acquisitions, came into her office at 9:15 on a Monday morning with his jacket already slightly disheveled and his expression doing the particular thing it did when he was about to deliver information he had been holding longer than he should have. "We have a problem with Meridian," he said. Eleanor set down her coffee. "Sit down and tell me." He sat. He told her. It took 20 minutes. By the end of it, she understood the following: that Meridian's senior leadership had conducted the mass layoff of 42 employees 18 months ago with advance knowledge that it violated Federal WARN Act provisions, that this knowledge had been documented in internal communications that were, in theory, subject to disclosure through acquisition due diligence, that those communications had not been disclosed, and that Hartwell Capital's own preliminary acquisition review team, specifically Robert Davenport, had been in communication with Meridian executives during the period in question. She looked at Robert for a long moment. "What exactly does in communication mean?" she said. Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Standard acquisition dialogue. I was doing preliminary valuation work. They contacted me. And the communications about the layoffs? I didn't know what I was looking at," he said. "At the time." Eleanor heard the careful precision of "at the time" and felt something cold move through her. "And now?" He looked at the window. "Now I have a clearer picture." She thought about the Meridian folder on her desk. She thought about the deal she had been shepherding for 6 weeks, the one that was supposed to expand her portfolio and prove to her board that her pregnancy had not affected her judgment. She thought about 42 people and 2 weeks of severance and a WARN Act that existed for exactly the reason that it existed. "Get out," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Don't go to your office. Don't make any calls. Wait in the conference room for legal. Eleanor, now Robert." He left. She sat alone in her office for 3 minutes. Her hand was on her stomach, as it was always when she needed to think. The baby moved, slow, deliberate, a reminder. She picked up the phone and called her head of legal. Then she called her board chair. Then she sat back and breathed and thought about trust, which was the subject she seemed to be circling constantly lately, like a planet with too much gravity to escape. She thought about William. She thought about his file. Meridian Logistics Group, Regional Operations Coordinator, one of the 42. Terminated with 2 weeks severance, no prior notification. In what she now understood was a deliberately calculated violation. He had come to her building, and worked the night shift for 14 months, and never said a word to her about any of it. He had known who she was. He had known what company she was acquiring. And he had covered her shoulders with his jacket and told her she shouldn't sleep in the chair. She was still sitting with this when Priya knocked and opened the door. "Mr. Caldwell is at the front desk," she said. "He says he has something he'd like to speak with you about. He says it concerns the Meridian acquisition." Eleanor looked at her assistant. Something moved through her chest that she couldn't immediately name. It was too layered. Too much at once. Relief, maybe. And something sharper underneath it. "Send him up," she said. He arrived 8 minutes later. He was in his regular clothes. Not the uniform, it was daytime. He was off the clock. Dark jeans, a plain grey Henley, the kind of clothes that looked like he'd put them on without thinking about them. He had a small external hard drive in his hand. He stopped in the doorway of her office and looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them in the space of a second that neither of them would have been able to articulate fully, but both of them felt with complete clarity. "You already know," he said. It wasn't a question. "My team found it this morning," she said. "Sit down, William." He sat. He put the hard drive on her desk. "I found these files when I was clearing out my office at Meridian, internal communications. I've had them for 14 months. He looked at her directly. "I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know if you were involved." "I wasn't." "I know," he said. "I know that now. I came to tell you because you deserve to hear it before you heard it another way. And because—" he stopped, adjusted. "Because I think those 41 other people deserve someone fighting for them. And you're the person with the resources to do it." Eleanor looked at the hard drive. She looked at him. She thought about everything the past 6 days had shown her. The test she had staged, that he had turned inside out simply by being who he was. The file she had read. The laugh she hadn't been able to stop. The way he'd said, "She's the most interesting person I know," with his whole face open. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" she said. "Because I wasn't sure you were someone I could trust." He held her gaze. "I needed to find out." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't require filling. Eleanor let it sit. Outside the window, Manhattan was gray and cold and indifferent. The way it always was. The way she had always preferred it. A city that didn't ask how you were feeling, that just kept moving. She had spent 5 years building a life in its image. She looked at the man across from her desk. A man who had lost his job to the company she was buying, who had spent 14 months making himself invisible in her building, who had covered her shoulders with his jacket and known she was awake and done it anyway. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer honestly." "Okay. The night in my office when you—" She paused. She was not accustomed to saying things like this. "Did you do that because you felt sorry for me?" He considered the question seriously. The way she'd already come to understand, he considered most things. "No," he said. "I did it because you looked cold, and the jacket was right there." He paused. "And because you had your hand on your stomach, and you looked like someone who was carrying something very heavy, and I know what that's like." and it seemed like the only reasonable response to the situation. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up the hard drive. She turned it over in her hands once. She set it beside her phone. "I'm going to stop the acquisition," she said, "until a full internal audit is complete and the WARN Act situation is resolved. The affected employees are going to receive what they're legally owed, with interest." She looked at him. "That includes you." William was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that. That's not why I came." "I know it isn't," Eleanor said. "That's why I'm doing it." He looked at her, and she saw it again. The thing she'd seen in the ice cream shop description Maya had sent spiraling through her imagination. The thing she'd been catching glimpses of for 6 days now, in the lines of a man who had chosen, in every situation she had been able to observe, to simply be good. Not strategically, not as a calculation, not as just because it was the only way he knew how to be. She had not known until this moment how profoundly she had believed that people like that did not exist. "My daughter has her own theory about you," William said unexpectedly. Eleanor blinked. "About me?" "I told her I'd met someone interesting at work," he almost smiled. "She asked if you were good people. I said I thought so. She said, 'Then why do you look worried?'" Eleanor's throat tightened. She did not look away. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was figuring it out." A pause. "I think I figured it out." The room held them both. The gray-eyed morning pressing against the clean window. The city below going about its 10,000 ordinary tasks. And in this office a woman who had stopped trusting people 5 years ago, and a man who had spent 14 months being invisible, looking at each other across a mahogany desk with a hard drive between them and something crackling in the air that was neither simple nor small. Eleanor pressed her palm against her stomach. The baby rolled, a long, slow movement, an affirmation. "I have a favor to ask," she said. "Okay. I'd like to meet Maya." Something crossed William Caldwell's face, swift and unguarded, brighter than anything she'd seen from him yet. And he looked down for just a moment, and when he looked back up, his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. "She'd like that," he said. "She's been planning what to wear." Eleanor looked at him. Something moved in her chest, enormous and terrifying and completely outside her control, and she let it. "Tell her to wear the pink one," Eleanor said. "I hear it's the important dress." The audit took 11 weeks. Eleanor had not expected it to be clean, and it wasn't. What her legal team uncovered inside Meridian's records over those 11 weeks was the kind of corporate document that made experienced attorneys go quiet in a specific way, not shocked. Because they had seen versions of this before, but grimly unsurprised, the way people look when the world confirms something they had hoped was not true. The layoffs had been calculated precisely to avoid triggering the WARN Act's full provisions while still displacing 42 people. The timing had been deliberate. Several senior executives at Meridian had been aware, and Robert Davenport, her VP of Acquisitions, had received enough information during preliminary review to have flagged it for Eleanor's attention and had chosen not to. Robert resigned before the audit was complete. Eleanor accepted his resignation with a 4-line email and spent no further emotional energy on it. The 42 former Meridian employees received certified letters in early February, 11 weeks after William had set the hard drive on Eleanor's desk. The letters outlined the WARN Act settlement that Hartwell Capital had agreed to fund in advance of the full acquisition closing. Back pay, benefits restitution, and a lump sum that reflected the human cost of a decision made by people who had believed no one would ever add it up. Eleanor had sat with her legal team for 3 hours negotiating the exact terms, and when they had tried to suggest a lower figure, she had looked at them with the expression that had earned her the word ruthless twice in print and said, "These are people, not a line item." The room had gotten quiet, and the number had gone back up. She had not told the press. She had not issued a statement. She had simply made it right as quietly and completely as she could, and moved on to the next problem. Maya Caldwell visited the 32nd floor of Hartwell Tower on a Saturday morning in early December. wearing a hot pink dress and small white shoes with a bow on each one, holding Gerald the rabbit under one arm and her father's hand in the other. She was 6 years old, and she walked into Eleanor's office with the unhurried confidence of someone who had decided in advance that this was going to be a good place. She looked around the office with careful attention. She looked at the view. She looked at Eleanor, at the blonde hair, the round belly now 7.5 months along, the soft grey sweater Eleanor had worn because it was Saturday and she was trying something new. "Your baby is very big," Maya said, with scientific accuracy. "She is," Eleanor agreed. "She'll be here next month." "Is she going to have a name?" "I'm still deciding." Eleanor had been still deciding for 7 months, and the list on her phone had 17 names on it, none of which felt right. She had told no one this, because it seemed like the kind of thing that should feel easier than it did. Maya considered this seriously. "Gerald didn't have a name for 2 days," she said, "and then I knew." "You'll know." Eleanor looked at this 6-year-old person, this small, absolute pink-dressed person, and felt something she didn't have a clean word for, something that was partly awe, partly recognition. Mostly the particular warmth of encountering a soul that had arrived in the world, already sure of itself. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said. "Yes," said Maya. "What's your favorite thing?" Maya didn't hesitate. "Breakfast," she said, "because it's always the start." Eleanor heard William exhale beside her, a quiet sound, almost a laugh, the sound of a person hearing something for the 100th time and loving it the same as the first. She looked at him. He was looking at his daughter with that expression, the one she had first seen when he'd said, "She's the most interesting person I know." And Eleanor thought about what it meant to have a face that went that open when it looked at something it loved. She had been building walls for 5 years. She had been very good at it. She was beginning to wonder about the things she had walled out. The 3 of them had breakfast in Eleanor's office. She had ordered from the good deli on 54th because Maya had mentioned 3 minutes into the visit that she hadn't eaten yet and was, in her words, getting to the emergency level. They sat around the small table by the window, and Maya told Eleanor about volcanoes and the Natural History Museum, and a boy in her class named Trevor who had tried to take her crayons and had been unsuccessful. Eleanor listened with complete attention and responded with the seriousness the topics deserved. William watched both of them and said very little and drank his coffee. At one point, Maya looked at Eleanor's stomach and said, "Can I say hi to her?" Eleanor blinked. "Sure." Maya leaned forward in her chair and said, very clearly to Eleanor's belly, "Hi, I'm Maya. I live in Washington Heights. I have a rabbit named Gerald. You're going to like it out here. It's pretty good." Eleanor pressed her lips together very hard. She felt William's hand cover hers on the table. Brief, warm, not presumptuous, just there, and then withdraw. She looked at him. He was looking out the window. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Charlotte Eleanor Hartwell was born on January 11th, 3 days ahead of schedule, at 6:42 in the morning at New York Presbyterian, in a delivery room where the only person Eleanor had asked to be present, besides the medical staff, was Priya, her assistant, who had shown up with her overnight bag and a thermos of Eleanor's preferred decaf, and had sat in the chair beside the bed for 11 hours without being asked to leave, and without once trying to make conversation that Eleanor didn't initiate. Charlotte arrived with her eyes already open, which the nurses said was unusual, and with a full head of dark hair, which Eleanor had not expected, and with the immediate furious, full-bodied declaration of her own presence that suggested she had views about the world that she intended to express. Eleanor held her in the white quiet of that morning and thought, "You." The list of 17 names collapsed to one, instantly and without debate. William came to the hospital that afternoon with Maya, who had been allowed to miss school for the occasion, because William had, rightly Eleanor thought, categorized it as educational. Maya came in carrying a card she had made herself in hot pink marker, which said "Welcome Baby" on the front, and on the inside had a drawing of what appeared to be Eleanor, a baby, Gerald the rabbit, a volcano, and William, all standing in a row with large smiles. Under the drawing, in careful 6-year-old handwriting, she had written, We are glad you are here. Eleanor looked at the card for a long time. Charlotte, in her arms, made a small sound. She likes it, Maya said confidently. She does, Eleanor agreed. William stood at the edge of the room with his hands in his pockets, looking at the two of them, Eleanor in the hospital bed. Charlotte against her chest, Maya perched on the chair beside them, holding Gerald at a respectful distance so as not to overwhelm the baby. He looked at all of it with the expression Eleanor had come to know over the past 11 weeks. The open, careful, entirely unperformed look of a man who was present to whatever was in front of him. She met his eyes across the room. She thought about a night in October, a grey jacket, a window made spotless. She thought about a hard drive and 42 people, and a decision made in the quiet of a kitchen at midnight. She thought about a 6-year-old who had looked at a woman she'd never met and said, "You're going to like it out here." It's pretty good. She thought about the word trust, what she had believed it meant, the testing of it, the staging of it, the small and careful way she had tried to measure it out like a resource that might run dry. She thought about what William had done instead, which was simply to be exactly who he was. Consistently, in every observable situation, asking nothing and offering what was there to offer. She thought that she had spent 5 years trying to protect herself from something that turned out to be entirely soluble. That the antidote had been available all along. That it was not a system or a test or a strategy. It was this, showing up, covering someone's shoulders, telling the truth when it would have been much easier not to, letting a 6-year-old name things without correction. It was ordinary. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. It was also, she was beginning to understand, the rarest. "Thank you," she said to William. Quietly, so it was just for him. He looked at her. He knew what she meant. He always did. "You would have figured it out," he said. "You just needed someone to leave the jacket." Eleanor looked down at Charlotte, who had closed her eyes. Finally, after 40 minutes of furious wakefulness, conceding to sleep with the reluctant dignity of someone who had made her point. She was impossibly small. She was completely real. She smelled like the beginning of something. "Will you stay?" Eleanor said. "For a little while." William pulled a chair to the other side of the bed. Maya climbed up beside him and arranged Gerald on her lap and looked around the room with the satisfaction of someone who had come somewhere she intended to return to. They stayed. Outside the window of the hospital room, New York City was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, enormous, full of people trying to find their way from one place to another, full of people who had lost things and were looking for them, full of people who had learned, or were learning, or were refusing to learn that the things most worth finding were almost never hidden. They were right there, in the ordinary moments, in the quiet choices, in a grey jacket left on a credenza, in a child who named her rabbit Gerald and knew, at 6 years old, that breakfast mattered because it was always the start. Charlotte Hartwell slept. Her mother held her. Across the bed, a man who had spent 14 months being invisible sat in the light of a winter afternoon and was finally, completely seen. And somewhere in that room, in the warmth of it, in the unremarkable and extraordinary fact of 4 people gathered around something new and fragile and full of possibility, something that had been sealed for a very long time, opened its doors. And let the light come in. Some people enter your life quietly. They don't announce themselves. They don't make promises or claim space. They simply show up and do the right thing and wait. And if you're lucky, if you're paying attention, you see them. And everything changes. Charlotte grew up knowing this story. She asked for it, the way children ask for the stories that belong to them on the nights when the world felt too big. And every time, Eleanor would begin the same way. "There was a night when I was very tired, and I thought I was alone. And a man left his jacket on my shoulders and didn't ask for anything in return." "And then what?" Charlotte would ask.